when you are in incident mode, I think one, it's important that you do have like an incident commander who is in
Mhm.
charge. And I think that's so tremendously important that they are empowered to be able to make these decisions. And that is their role, to coordinate this incident, not to do the analysis or the forensics themselves, is to make sure that the work is getting done and being prioritized accordingly. And I think in like severe incidents, everywhere I've worked at, everyone just comes together and it's just a beautiful thing to see, right? No one says, I have another priority.
Yeah.
No one is like, why did you page me? Like you don't hear those things when the sky actually is falling. And and the reason you get that is not only are people passionate about their jobs, is but because you don't abuse it otherwise.
Hi, everyone. This week, I am delighted to be joined on the Future of Security Operations podcast by Andrew Santell. Andrew is an experienced security leader who worked for the US Navy for over a decade before moving into the private sector. In 2021, he founded the security operations program at Netflix, and recently he joined edge cloud platform Fastly, where he is the director of security operations. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Thomas.
Before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and some of your journey to date?
Sure. So as you mentioned today, I lead the security operations team at Fastly, which includes detection engineering, incident response, vulnerability management, application security, pen testing, and security engineering. And to throw a quick pitch out there for Fastly, for those who aren't familiar with it, our goal here is to make an internet a better place through fast, safe, and engaging experiences. So we have a few offerings like an edge cloud platform, as you mentioned, a content delivery network, and we also have a lot of security products like a web application firewall. And yeah, prior to Fastly, was with Netflix most recently, and then before that with the Navy. So to kind of go back in time and kind of how I got here. So I think technology was, well, one, I was very fortunate to be able to have access to technology as a kid. So as long as I can remember, building computers, breaking them, translated to breaking in video games. I think it was around undergrad timeframe where I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And so I was taking like generic courses, computer science, finance, stuff like that. And security courses started to become a thing around this time frame. And it was
Mhm.
kind of this realization that, whoa, you can actually make a career out of security. So kind of went down that path, started focusing more on it in grad school. And then after school, I found myself working for the Navy. And I started first in a kind of research and development type role, which at the time was really interesting. I got to work on all sorts of complex and diverse projects, both offensive, defensive. I found myself focusing on like deceptive technologies and stuff like that. But after a short time, I got bored. It wasn't fast paced enough for me. So I very quickly found myself in more of an operational role, leading incidents and very fast paced, very large incidents, as you'd imagine for the Navy. A lot of really interesting threats and risks associated with working there. And after doing that for a little bit, I started to see a lot of gaps or holes in, say, our like the security posture and the architecture, and things that we should be fixing to reduce these incidents from happening in the first place. So I moved a little bit more into an architecture role and then into an engineering role to really try to not only improve the security posture, but also give the security operations teams better tools, right? Having lived all the challenges with maybe not having the right logs or not being able to respond to things as quickly because of certain tools or workflows or infrastructure. So I set down on this path to basically fix all of this and try to provide all these tools to the operators so that they could respond more quickly and more effectively. So moved into that, kind of delivering these security operation tools to the Navy. And then a handful of other kind of leadership roles in leading other large programs there before moving over to Netflix.
I love it. You can always tell how somebody's going more senior when they start plugging the company that they're working for. I I like to hear it. So you're in an operational role. You're working in the Navy. You've got tons of experience on the defensive side. What are some of the tools that you want to build? What do you want to share?
What do I want to build today?
No, well,
Yeah.
what did you want to build then? And then
um,
I'll definitely ask about what you want to build now and what's different. But back then, you've spent a couple of years working in in the trenches. I know that's not quite the appropriate phrase for the Navy. I don't know what the phrase is, but yeah. What I suppose what tools did you look at? What were you like? Hey, this is what I need. This is what I want to give to the other people that are that to help them do their jobs.
Yeah. I don't know if to some extent it is, the foundations and the basics, right?
Yeah.
Being able to have visibility and the right telemetry was really, really important. And there was more than a handful of investigations where it was difficult to gather. And some of this, there are some unique requirements that really only exist at the Navy, perhaps. So if you think of all these little floating cities that we have called ships, right, it's really difficult to just say pull all of the data back at any given time, right? So we had to kind of get creative for how do we collect this and store this, because it's not like we have massive data centers on these ships either, right? So being able to collect the right data and being really specific about what that is was really important. Also, with the sheer size of that is like back then, I would say we were much more of a signature-based detection
Hmm.
community industry. And then if you do this again at this scale, it can be really challenging to kind of filter, even when you have an alert fire. Okay, if you have thousands or tens of thousands of alerts at any given time, how do you make sense of that, right? So the first step was getting that right telemetry, being really specific about what we log, and making sure it's the right kinds of logs. Sure, ideal world, infinite money, infinite resources, you want all the things. But we had to be really creative around what it is. We also started investigating more of the behavioral or anomaly type detections, right? Because again, that signature based can be helpful in certain scenarios. But again, it didn't really scale to the size that we had. Or more specifically, if you're looking at, say, industrial control systems, weapon systems, things like that, you're more looking for those anomalies or what's not normal. So there was a lot of investment kind of in trying to figure out things that strayed away from that normal. And then even if you do collect all this data and all this alerts, how do you do this in a distributed fashion and at scale, right? The Navy is in some senses, it's one Navy, but at the same time, it's a lot of smaller organizations that comprise that larger Navy. So being able to provide this data and these tools in a distributed fashion, so that anyone in the world who's working on these operations can quickly be able to access that. And then, of course, just all the kind of standard stuff that comes with running a security operations program, like ticketing and case management. Are we pulling in and actually leveraging a lot of the threat intelligence that we have, threat hunting? At that time, we weren't quite in the automation space. I think that was more of a dream than kind of a roadmap type item, but it was definitely something that we were working on the foundations to be able to march towards.
Yeah, it's incredible, and like it's funny. A lot of and I've had plenty of people on the podcast, but a lot of folks, myself included, when we worked at like fast growing tech companies or the likes of a Netflix, which we'll talk about at some stage, we're like, oh, the scale that we're working at, we've got thousands of data centers and hundreds of people and millions of devices to defend, and this is a challenge that's unique. And it's like, actually no, there's plenty of other organizations that have had to solve these some of these challenges beforehand. um how do you make decisions? How do you prioritize? There's a great phrase that's generals always fight the last battle they lost. I'm not asking you to go into any incidents, but how do you, like, when you've got a challenge the scale of what you're facing, how do you say, actually, this is the next thing we need to prioritize, this is the next tool we need to buy, this is the next. Yeah, did you have a framework for making those decisions?
I think there's maybe the approach that I would like to apply, and then there's some times where the decision I ended up making, I'll kind of describe what I mean. So ideally, I'm very much a big believer of risk-driven decision making,
Mhm.
quantitative risk analysis. We could spend the whole podcast talking about that, but it can be tough to do that, and especially again at sheer scale, how do you truthfully do that? But I do try to kind of in all decision making, even in private life, it's all risk-based type decisions, right? And when we think about risk, it's really important to, most listeners know it's impact and likelihood, and
Mhm.
making sure that we don't focus on just one or the other. So when I am looking at those things, I am making these decisions. Really, what is a top risk item? But it also comes down to possibly the cost and level of effort there too, right? So sometimes the largest risk item might take us several years to actually be able to mitigate. And maybe we want to get that started, but sometimes there can be other things that are possibly those quicker wins that can still help us buy down enough risk. But it can also be informed based on the budget that we're given. But I think the other thing was what I'm getting at as well is when it's not risk-based decision, you're kind of looking at what you believe is just achievable or accomplishable. So I'm going to look at my leadership, my stakeholders, and try to figure out what is their tolerance for being able to adopt something like this. And if something I recognize this is going to be an uphill battle. This is going to be really difficult. Maybe we make the baby steps on that and then slowly focus on the other things. So in a sense there, it's kind of a sense of just realism or pragmatism to try to be able to say, hey, if this is more achievable, this might be able to buy us down enough risk rather than taking everything. But in my ideal world, I do try to really make sure it's a risk-based decision.
Can you give me an example of some decision like that you made where you're like, actually, this is this is important. This is a risk that we identified, and we're gonna it's unlikely or it's extremely likely, and we're gonna we're going to prioritize it. Or I was how you go about that.
Yeah, there was a example. I guess maybe at Netflix. I was starting to, as I'm learning kind of what decisions we made, and I think Netflix did a fantastic job at being able to quantify risk, and we actually knew where we believed our top risks were. And when I got there, I started asking questions, trying to learn more. Well,
Mhm.
why would this be prioritized? And there was a few areas. One, for example, was investments in phishing, and I was kind of surprised given how like you go to I don't know Verizon's threat report or whomever, and you constantly see phishing as a very, very high attack vector, if not number one, depending on the year. And so I wanted to learn more as to why. And as I kind of pulled that thread, it was kind of like, well, we don't have infinite resources. It's not our number one. So it wasn't prioritized at the moment. So this was something that I started to surface and kind of felt like this, like I'm not saying we need to spend all sorts of money or we need to dedicate a team or hire a team to focus on it. But I did want to take a little bit of time to investigate it. So what we ended up actually doing was kind of forming a really small like group just to kind of, hey, let's just do another quick self-assessment of our capabilities here, of what the threat is. And basically we started taking a look at it and understanding what controls and mitigations that we actually had in place. Basically, we red teamed ourselves, right? And we
Is
said,
this, just to clarify, is this prod or corp or both?
so this was specifically looking at phishing. So this is more corp.
Corp. Okay, yeah, got it. Rather than phishing Netflix users is what I'm trying to.
Yeah. So not
Yeah.
our
So
users,
yeah.
our
Okay. Yeah.
internal
Yeah.
employees.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So we did our own little red team assessment, and basically we started looking what would happen if someone clicked on a link and so on, despite the threat possibly being
Mhm.
there. And what we found through this assessment was we were actually pretty well protected through just some controls we had in place. We had a really good zero trust environment,
Yep.
so that if someone got in, they're not quickly able to move around laterally. They were pretty much contained to a specific environment. So this level is like you can't necessarily red team every single capability out there or everything that you do. Like usually red teams are very targeted, right? So by being able to kind of conduct this risk assessment in one area, we were able to say, actually our assumptions were correct in this case. So maybe not the best example because this was one that I didn't continue to push for because we actually found that the risk was within an acceptable level or within our tolerance. But there are probably other examples where I've had to fight more, but that one thankfully was in a pretty good state.
Yeah, but also a fantastic example in as much as like in a world of limited resources and again non-infinite budget, being able to say actually we made we did a quick analysis, we got the data that we needed, and we decided not to pursue something or not to prioritize something at least for the time being because there's bigger fish to fry. Yeah, it's really helpful to have that. Yeah, have an example of that sort of decision making in that framework to reference for anybody else. So I know we talked about Netflix here, but like, so you were in the Navy for 10 years. When, what was your journey to decide, I'm, uh, like this, this is enough, a sailor's life for me no more.
Yeah, it was an extremely rewarding experience, and I definitely wouldn't have changed it. But I got to the point where I felt like I was no longer being challenged in the way that I needed to be. My learning and growth was limited. I did see more like leadership opportunities if I wanted to continue to advance my career. I'm sure I would have been able to do that at some point. But it wasn't just about like advancement or titles or roles. I was really looking for new challenges. And I felt at that time the really only way to do that was to learn something new, right? A new tech stack, a new culture,
Mhm.
just threats, new risks, new problems. So I knew at that time that I was ready to go, but I was also looking for the right opportunity. And Netflix was a company that I had always kind of followed. Their culture can be pretty famous out there. There's books written on it, and it sounded like somewhere that I really wanted to be part of. And so made the leap, and it was really exciting opportunity because it was also basically building from scratch, right? So it was, hey, we think we need the security operations team and program, go figure it out. And having had done that with the Navy and also with the Navy, I was afforded this tons of opportunities just to meet so many different companies and across so many different industries. If you kind of say, hey, I work for the Navy, we're trying to learn best practices. For the most part, everyone was willing to kind of let us in the door, maybe tour their security operations centers, meet their teams. So it was a really exciting opportunity to kind of do this right and build this from scratch.
Nice. So what did you, I suppose, I guess I don't think you're quite doing something similar for like Fast here, a public company, but like what did you notice? What did you notice in that transition? What were the big differences that you're like, hey, this is yeah, they do things differently.
Yeah. So I think one of the first realizations is an obvious one, but we calculate risks a lot differently. Like in the Navy, if you're looking at the sensitivity of data or an incident, it's often measured in loss of life, unfortunately, right? But in
Yeah.
the private sector, it's about loss of revenue. But while there were a lot of differences, and I think to be honest, I was pretty intimidated at first. Like, hey, this is all I ever know was working for the Navy. This is a massive change, and I was scared. I wasn't sure exactly how this transition would go. But thankfully, everyone's been very welcoming. But what was really helpful for me was to identify the commonalities, actually, right? So after maybe a few weeks, few months, I remember the first one was. I heard someone talking about NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST CSF, and it really caught me off guard that people in the private sector would be talking about NIST CSF, right? And it very quickly, wait, I'm like, I know that. I can help with this. And, we're using that to kind of measure our cybersecurity program. Speaking of, one major difference is people don't say cyber in certain places,
Yeah, they
right?
don't.
So kind of like learning a new language almost and trying to make sure I don't say cyber or certain acronyms. So there was some transition there.
It's okay. You just won't look cool while you do it. But that's
Great. But yeah, I think finding those commonalities kind of helped with any like imposter syndrome. And you start to realize, time after time, project after project, like for example, we talked about logging earlier in telemetry, like had that exact same problem of what logs are important to us? How do we store them? How do we query against them? We had to do an assessment of a new endpoint detection and response tool. Cool, I've done this before, right? So
Mhm.
you start to see that there actually is more in common than I think I initially anticipated. So for anyone listening and trying to decide should I go or should I not go, like I can't answer that. But if you're afraid to go because you think you might not fit in or because everything is going to be too different, I think you'd be pleasantly surprised that there's actually a lot more in common, right? I mean, information security, whatever you want to call it, the foundations are the same, right? There might be slightly different tools, approaches, cultures, budgets, but at the end of the day, we're still all trying to protect the organization.
Completely. It's I really like the way of thinking about that as well. That like actually, yeah, you no matter where you are, no matter where you're coming from, there's a ton of new things that you can, or a ton of experience that you can bring to your role. And the stuff that the stuff that you have in common is often greater than the stuff that you're scared about. Um, what I suppose what were some of the things that you think you did, or that the Navy did extremely well, then, or that the like public sector, or the military did. I suppose what are some of the things that you think that you could bring, or that other people could bring from there? Say, actually, this is an improvement. Obviously, you're 100% right. Like cybersecurity frameworks and measuring is not something the private industry do, and I think we have a lot of turnover. But Yeah, what are some of the things that you did bring that you'd recommend other people implement?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm going to answer a little bit differently because there's things that I think went well and didn't go well, and both of those combined have kind of shaped my view. So the first thing that comes to
Interesting.
mind is there's a very bad word in private industry which we call process, right? And I remember it's almost like we don't talk about process. We want to give like developers, engineers freedom, but as companies mature and grow, you recognize the value of process. So to be honest, at the Navy, there was mountains of process, and a lot of them I think did slow us down to an extent. And so I wasn't trying to copy process for process and say we need to do this, because again, maybe not the best implementation of, but what it did kind of teach me is the value of a good process and what a bad process looks like, right? So process can create a lot of efficiencies, right? So maybe that's a process to evaluate risk and how do you conduct a risk assessment, or maybe it's how do you prioritize the things that you work on, right? So no, I'm not saying you need 20 people to approve time off, right? That's an example of bad process. But there were a lot of things, and just kind of applying that mindset to look for efficiencies, which is actually was like a really I didn't realize this until I moved into private sector, but that process is actually the transition to automations, right? Once
Mhm.
you start figuring how you can repeat something and create a standard process for it, that creates the opportunity to actually be able to automate that process. So if you don't have the processes, then you're not really able to automate, and kind of have that consistent kind of process around there. And then the other thing I would just say is sheer scale, right? We kind of talked about this earlier, but when we looked at something, we really had to take into account how does this work in all sorts of environments, whether that's a data center, a ship, potentially an aircraft. So being able to take into all these requirements and figure out how do we scale this to millions of users potentially.
Mhm.
Now, again, technology stacks possibly a little bit different. Navy at the time was still much more on-prem than on cloud. We were kind of transitioning at that phase. Problems are a little bit different than in the private industry. But nevertheless, kind of looking at a problem, and before implementing it, you're really taking a look at how do you scale that. So that's something that I brought with me, that even though, say right now at Fastly, we're, I think, 1,100 people, for example, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to deliver a solution that can't scale beyond 1,200 people or something like that, right? So being able to take how does this scale into account is a really good lesson learned.
I love it. Yeah, I think it's super relevant. It's super relevant to automation, obviously something close to my heart, but it's also for processes. It's like oftentimes, yeah, we have a process or you say, yeah, we're doing it this way, but it's actually just in your head. And by defining the process, not only are you like analyzing it reasonably critically and thinking about it, you're also setting yourself up. Like automation it's not the first step. It's, the almost the end step. The next step is probably like, write it down, train yourself in it, see what's missing, improve it. And then it's, train somebody else in it so that you can focus on, hey, if you define the process, you can teach it to somebody else. And then hopefully at some stage you'll be able to automate it. But yeah, we talk to so many customers who, and it's great. They're like, hey, how do you do X? Or we ask, how do you do X? They're like, yeah, this is how I do it. But until you have a process in place, you can't. It's really hard to automate it. And because there are going to be risk-based decisions that have to be taken, other decisions that have to be taken midway through.
Yeah, definitely.
Um. So then, yeah, you worked at Netflix for 2 years. You now are the director of security operations. Your role has expanded even more beyond beyond the SOC, and beyond security operations into pen testing, into application security, into vulnerability management. Um, why? What's the tell me what you yeah, do you like it?
Personally, I love it.
Good.
And I think they go hand in hand more than maybe initially thought, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the things. So at the time, I've only been here for 3 months, so it's definitely been a whirlwind of information and learning how do these teams work together, helping making sure we set the right strategy and the priorities here. But they really do go hand in hand, and I find my teams are constantly collaborating on a daily basis, whether that be, let's say, incident response. Log4j started as a vulnerability, right? Not necessarily an attack, right? So being able to lead a large scale incident through a vulnerability that might be identified is, one example. Tons of automation opportunities kind of across these teams here. But it's also this feedback loop that is so tremendously important, right? So if you see an incident, like your job doesn't stop as soon as you've kind of mitigated and stopped that threat, right? You need to gather what were your lessons learned from this, and then go inform, hey, can we improve our development process, our CI/CD pipeline? Do we have vulnerabilities out there that haven't been patched? And this is the reason why we got exploited, right? So we've created that feedback loop between these teams, and it's been really helpful so far. But also by knocking down the noise or just preventing these attacks from happening in the first place, that makes incident response a heck of a lot easier, right? So a lot of emphasis, this shift left, being more proactive. Can we reduce these vulnerabilities or whole classes of vulnerabilities? So when I look at vulnerability management, it's not just about patching, right? That's a huge part of it, and we've as an industry have kind of had this challenge for decades, right? I also look at whole kind of classes of vulnerabilities and things that can be prevented from ever coming in the first place. So, and vulnerability management has had some, we've had some challenges in kind of scaling this as well. But again, we've leveraged some automations to kind of be able to help with this. But trying to take a new approach to vulnerability management and not just send thousands of tickets over to engineering and say, here you go, fix this, right? But if we can be, to kind of piece this all together, if we can prioritize this truly based on risk and make sure we're going after the ones that really matter most to us, tailored to us. Don't just take the CVSS score and say, okay, we have 100 highs based on CVSS. If you actually do that analysis, you might actually only have 3 that are really applicable to your environment that you really care about. So yeah, I would say these teams work together on a regular basis. I think we need to continue to find more opportunities to, again, like limit or do more protections, more preventions in place, so we can kind of focus a little bit more on improving the processes around our response too.
Yeah, it's really important that the teams are together, or if they're not together, that they're like completely aligned. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but like gone are the days where security teams can be like yelling at each other, or yelling at IT, or yelling at engineering. They have to be 100% aligned. But being able to, it's not just like, hey, but how many devices, or how many endpoints, or how many, like, where is this vulnerability? It's how quickly can you tell? Because during an incident, like, it's not good enough to like just ask that question. It's how quickly can you respond? How quickly can you identify those, like what's affected by log4j, and how quickly can we patch? And having that under one owner who's responsible to say, actually, we need to be able to yeah, like move the needle on identifying these, and saying, actually, it's okay if this is not, if it's very unlikely that these are going to be exploited, then you've got whatever, a week to patch. But if it's quite likely, and there's like somebody else has access to this information, or somebody else is on our edge, then you do need to patch immediately.
Yeah, I think there's probably more. I'm thinking of like 3 different scenarios at the moment, though. One is just like day to day. We've for the most part have automated the assignment of a risk score with a given priority, right? So we do take CVSS in, we do take first EPSS, there's CISA, KEV, sorry for all the acronyms, but basically,
no, it's great.
More information around, is this like have a high probability of being exploited, is what EPSS is. And then KEV is, do we know for a fact that this has been exploited? So we take in this information, we've classified our assets. So we know we use like a tiering model, and we call it like a tier 1, others might call it a P0, whatever. But like, we know what assets are critical to us, right? So vulnerability on a public facing asset that processes customer data, yeah, we care a lot more about that, right? Taking into all this information, we can quickly assign. But then there are certain categories of things. Again, if it's getting a lot of, just say, attention, like we know it's being publicly exploited, all these things will quickly escalate on that. And if we actually see any evidence of us being potentially attacked, or anytime Log4j is one example. As soon as these proof of concepts are out there to exploit them, you just see massive scans across the internet, right? So if we start seeing us being, probed or potentially being attacked here, then we're going to quickly go into incident mode. When you are in incident mode, I think one, it's important that you do have like an incident commander who is in
Mhm.
charge. And I think that's so tremendously important that they are empowered to be able to make these decisions. And that is their role, to coordinate this incident, not to do the analysis or the forensics themselves, is to make sure that the work is getting done and being prioritized accordingly. And I think in like severe incidents, everywhere I've worked at, everyone just comes together and it's just a beautiful thing to see, right? No one says, I have another priority.
Yeah.
No one is like, why did you page me? Like you don't hear those things when the sky actually is falling. And and the reason you get that is not only are people passionate about their jobs, is but because you don't abuse it otherwise.
Yeah.
If you're paging people for SEV threes and fours and a low vulnerability, then they're not going to be there for you when you really need them. So making sure that you only use that call when you really need to is really important. So yeah, having that IMOC in charge or incident commander, being able to make those decisions, and yeah, being able to assess that severity and recognizing that the severity can change, right? So I think that's, as you learn more through your triage phase or, Log4j, I'm sure we all remember, did actually change, right? There was a patch that came out and we think we're all good. And then was a few days, a week later, oh, we found another vulnerability in here
Yeah.
and we had to kind of start the process all over again, right? So making sure that you're flexible and adaptable and making sure that you're shifting your process as the severity of the incident is also changing.
That's yeah. You've spoken so many truths there. I'm gonna clip that piece. It's extremely relevant. Um, what I've when I've been in those incidents, what I've it's everybody coming together, but because everybody it's everybody's you don't page them often, everybody's on the same page, but it's extremely clear that this is everybody's top priority. That like actually the sky is falling, so there is no well I'm gonna actually I have to deploy this or I have to look at this email. So it's really important that just people get on the same page. The other thing is that people learn. Like like 4J doesn't come along all that often, and you get a window to see what other people are doing. So the people that are working in the SOC, it's not that they enjoy the incidents, but they definitely they definitely get exposed to other teams and they get attention and they get the like that this it's what they've trained for. It's why you did your SANS courses. It's why you studied and read up all your blogs for the last 10 years, because hey, this is the time that you get to use it. Fastly process. I was looking earlier. You've got like I don't know, is it 160 data centers or something like that, and 28 million events every single second. What sort of like I suppose with that sort of scale, what can you see or can how do you? I suppose I'm asking for a plug here. How do you use it to help create a safer internet for the rest of us?
Yeah, great question. And to some extent, yes, we leverage our own technology. We have honestly just a fantastic team who's really focused on this. So we've published like threat reports kind of based
Mhm.
on the analytics and stuff that we've seen. And to some extent, I'm not sure this is the best strategy, but we have dedicated teams to focusing on different aspects of security in here, right?
Okay.
So have a security research team who is looking at all the data that's coming in and out of the Fastly infrastructure, but also keeping up with what's going on in the world. And to some extent, this will inform kind of product development and where we want to go, but it also helps inform internal Fastly. It also
Yeah,
helps
yeah.
inform our customers. So by dedicating focus on security research has really helped, I think, be helping our customers. We also have a dedicated team and service for our customers, right? So if one of our customers, maybe they're getting a denial of service, maybe they're dealing with a botnet issue, and maybe that's going through our infrastructure, we have a team that's dedicated to be able to help and support them. So where my role, at least today, is focused more on protecting Fastly. Of course, I'm also
Yep.
here to protect our customers, but primarily focusing on our infrastructure being attacked as opposed to kind of going through that. So all that to say, it's really a team effort here to be able to look at that. We do leverage a lot of our own tools, some custom built. We also have a lot of vendors in place to kind of help us be able to solve this at scale. But really, it's just been a fantastic team and a fantastic stack of technology that helps us to be able to scale to support this problem.
I love it. And if you like, you are cutting edge, but if you're thinking about like security operations has evolved a long time, a lot over the time since you've been in the Navy. And if you are the forefront, what are you thinking about or how do you describe the state of security operations today? And where do you think it's going in the next couple of years? How do you think about planning?
It's changed a lot. Same time, maybe not as like if you asked me 10
Drastically.
years ago where I think we'd be today, I don't think we're quite there. But the industry is also very um, diverse in a sense. We have a broad range of capabilities, maturities, approaches, budgets. So when we think about the industry as a whole, you will see teams who are at the cutting edge and maybe teams who are not, right? So I've seen a lot of changes. A few that come to mind. I do think the vendor space has changed a lot. I can remember more than a few times where had a gap, had a requirement, needed a control, and I went out to the market and I could not find a vendor that could do what we needed to do. So we had to go and build it. And if I look back now, like there are probably 20 different vendors who would have been able who solve that problem today that I had maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Right. So I think we're seeing massive growth in vendors. And I think they have listened at least to a lot of the things that I often gave feedback on, which is around interoperability and
Hmm.
not being proprietary, right? There were a lot of vendors, I think, back in the day that it was just scary to be able to like to fully adopt one of these tools. We felt like we were going to be locked in for 5 years or maybe never be able to get away from it. So I think having more interoperability in these tools have been just made them more appealing, and I think a positive impact for the community as a whole. If we look at like security, not just security operations, but if we look how that industry or the community has changed too, I think SecOps has adapted very, very well to that. For example, obviously we've moved more towards cloud infrastructure. We've moved towards a zero trust model. So then on the security operations side, you see less reliance on network-based IDSs or PCAP, right? The old saying, didn't happen if there's no PCAP. But today, I don't really hear people saying that, right? We care more, give me the access logs,
Yeah.
right? What's the host level telemetry like? So I think this shift in priorities from security operations is, directly tied to how the whole industry and how different companies are just architecting their security posture and so on. Um, Another thing that comes to mind is this big shift left. And we talked about this a little bit about being more proactive. And I see this a lot in like the application security and infrastructure security about putting different controls in place. And then you see the same thing on security operations, right? Threat hunting is much more of a thing today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And we actually see a lot of programs and a lot more people kind of investing time to more proactively identify maybe that be a vulnerability or maybe it's an active attack or anything like that, but more investment into the proactiveness here. The other thing I wanted to say, or kind of where I think we're going, maybe this is more of a dream than a reality. We'll see. But like 5 or 6 years ago, I think is when we first started to embrace automations as like a best practice. Some things come to mind where I think it was 2017 where Dropbox released the
Yeah.
Slack bot. You
Yeah.
automatically reach out to someone to say, "Did you perform this activity? Yes
Yeah.
or no." Awesome, right? Changed the industry. And then a year after, you have Netflix releasing their blog on sockless and
Yeah.
how to automate more of this process without having like a tier one kind of operator following this.
Yeah.
And then kind of again, people started to realize like this can be a reality. And there's probably not a team out there who this is not on their roadmap, right? Everyone embraces, yes, we need to automate more security operations. Yes, it's on our roadmap, but I think there's still a big struggle to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
So I think, again, back to my dream or what I'd hope is that it becomes more of a not just a best practice, but a standard or a requirement, right? So if you were to say start a new company and you told your customers that you're using MD5 to hash passwords or you're using SSL to protect your communications, they're going to look at them and be like, I'm not going to do business with you, right? And I hope that we get to the state where security operations is that requirement. Maybe it's part of your NIST CSF framework or whatever ISO framework or whatever else you use.
Yeah.
So rather than just it being a best practice, that it actually becomes like you don't start your operations unless you've kind of built in this automations from the beginning. So I really hope to see more of that kind of in the coming years. Probably can't talk about the future without talking about AI though. It's not here to take our jobs, but uh, there's not a world where that's not part of security operations, right? Maybe it doesn't take over everything, but I would love to see continued advancement there, being able to automate more, being able to identify threats that we just wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So I really look forward to the day that we can leverage and incorporate that a lot more into our operations.
Yeah, 100%. I think when we've been talking about it internally and with customers, there's such a tension between what you described as your previous, like, hey, I want to be able to like have automation and like, have like password hashing or like better, whatever, password storage. I'm using this as an example to say that the compliance function is very much validate, as in like, hey, I've said I'm doing something and like I can validate it, which is, it's observable, it's reason, you can reason with it, you can understand it. And that's super, and ideally you can automate it, and that's super important. So any AI should probably also not just be a black box that's like, yeah, we use AI and therefore that's our that's our system. But yeah, it's definitely coming, and it's definitely going to be able to do all of the things that you're yeah that you're uh yeah that you're suggesting. And it's we're recording here at the end of 2023 when so that's at that point Andrew doesn't think it's coming for all of our jobs, or the singularity is coming along anyway. Um in the area of vuln management, I know that's an area you've taken on a lot. Where do you think that's going? What are you I suppose, what are you excited to see coming down the line, or is there anything in that area that you're like, hey, this is going to be, this is something to watch out for?
Yeah. Well, firstly, and not to like continue to poke on the automation thing, but one of the challenges that we have, and I think a lot of other people have, is everyone has a complex infrastructure and environment. You don't have just one operating system that you rely on, right? So to kind of gain the right picture, you do need to have multiple different sources, scanners, probably sign up for multiple reports. You probably have a bug bounty report, right? So you just have these multitude of sources kind of coming in, and being able to make sense of that is really important to kind of to get ahead of this problem. I do really big on this risk scoring and prioritization to make sure that we can make the most sense
Yeah.
of it. I would love to see, again, maybe not 5 years, but we have seen some examples of like self-healing or self-remediation. I think that's the dream, right? And I think, what was this, DEF CON's Cyber Grand Challenge like several years ago, right? Where the team, I believe the system was called Mayhem, which the idea was to you're getting attacked, self-heal, right? So I think it'd be really great if we can get to the point of known vulnerability. Hey, here's a patch. Can we patch this and then push this out to prod? The biggest concern with that is, making sure you're getting the right testing in there, especially like for us at Fastly, we do have a lot of hardware infrastructure, and we have to so we time our patches accordingly. We definitely don't want to impact customers or anyone, and that's probably true for most companies. But being able to self-remediate and self-patch, at least for maybe it's not your really high ones. Maybe you start with the lower severity ones, but if we can get to that point to be able to identify that and patch, that's the dream.
I love it. Yeah, that's the truth. It's true with all automation. Like, you can, people are like, oh, maybe it won't, but it's like, yeah, let's try it. Let's see what it works out, or let's see how it works out for the next 2 weeks, 3 months, and then after 3 months, they're like, let's just do it for everything. Let's just turn it on. And if the CEO's laptop gets isolated, the CEO's laptop gets isolated. Probably shouldn't have did whatever he or she did. Like, you've been involved in and you've led like security operations teams in two different companies now. What's the number one piece of advice you'd give to somebody else who's like on the journey, either to in a like fast growing security operations team, or thinking about taking on a role where they're going to be leading a security operations team in the future?
First and foremost, people, being able to take care of your team, building a strong team, having a good diverse hiring pipeline and bringing on the right people, and then doing everything you can to retain them. I mean, they are what make you successful, and just being a good human, taking care of them, making sure you're building trust and supporting their career growth. That's absolutely the best thing that you can do. But I also think about prioritization being extremely important. And I mentioned this earlier, but just being pragmatic around your approach. So ideally, everything is risk driven, but I think just recognizing that we can't do literally everything, right? There are so many things in security that we need to do, and at the same time, you're constantly fighting incidents. But if you actually prioritize things and say, and also deprioritize, right? If you say, we are not going to touch this for a quarter or for a year, and you actually call that out, it rather, like, if it's just in a backlog, your team sees that backlog and they stress about it. They try to get something done so they can pull something off that backlog. But if you actually like pull that backlog and actually, I don't know, put it in a parking lot, a separate term, something that you don't actually look out, I think that'll help you really focus in on your top priorities. So, big fan of doing a few things really well than trying to do everything not so well. So, being able to really focus on the things that you really need to do and just accept the risk with all those other things, I think is really important.
100%. And like mental health is a huge challenge for security operations and like SOC folks especially. But part of that is that like it's the never ending nature. And if you give people like, hey, look, we're accepting this risk. We're not going to tell you about it. Not that we're not going to tell you about it. We're not going to force you to work it because like, hey, it's a business decision. We're accepting this. You don't need to worry about it. Your work is done. It removes some of the pressure that this is your responsibility, and if you don't get to it, then it was because we got breached because you messed up.
Yeah, and related to that is actually making sure that engineering and automations are part of that priority and your
100%.
strategy, your guiding principle, whatever it
It's
is.
getting better.
Yeah, I was just
Sorry.
gonna say,
Yeah, go for it.
yeah, no, it reminds me of take a page out of Google's SRE handbook that I know you and many folks are familiar with. But if you're constantly dealing with operations, this operational toil, you will burn out, right? So back to the topic of mental health being so extremely important, and it's so easy to fall behind. Like you do have to be proactive in supporting mental health, and it's not just hours work. It's not just making sure people don't get paged in the middle of the night. It's about taking care of your folks and making sure that they're challenged, they're able to work on things that they want to work on, right? So if they're constantly dealing with a process or a manual task and not actually prioritizing and putting in your strategy that automations is important, then they're going to start to burn out or look elsewhere.
Is that something you've done in Fastly?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we do a few things. Firstly, we do leverage a managed detection and response.
Yeah.
That was really important to me that, we don't always know when an incident comes in if this is a high severity. Like if there's a high severity, yes, wake up everyone, wake me up, call us. We'll be there. Again, we'll come together. But being able to have a dedicated team that's able to do that initial triage for us has really been able to keep our mental health under control to some extent. And we also, again, we've talked about how do we prioritize automations. Within my first 3 months here, I built guiding principles and our strategies, and that's absolutely in there. So as we're building our quarterly OKRs, I'm looking to see what are we automating this quarter or what are we building? But then also just making sure good rotations and stuff like that. So someone's not always on call, right? They're not always doing the operational work, even if it's during their business hours. They have dedicated time for engineering as well. It's been really important. And then lastly, big priority at Fastly, but also for me is that career growth piece, right? So having regular conversations with everyone, understanding what's going well, what could be better, are they being challenged, and just making sure that we're giving them the opportunities to actually be able to work on that has been just a huge priority of mine.
I love it. Speaking of career growth, we're almost out of time, but I hear you're hiring in Fastly right now.
Definitely. Yes, I'm hiring, and it'll be interesting to see exactly how much we're able to hire next year as well. But at the moment, yes, I do have headcount coming. So if you're looking for a detection and response role with heavy emphasis on engineering, please reach out. Please be on the lookout. Those will be posted all the usual places, Fastly, LinkedIn, and whatever. So I'm very excited to be growing the team, being able to expand our scope.
Love it. And if people want to, find out a little bit more about you, about your journey, keep in touch, follow up. What's the best way?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best. I'll accept all the requests that kind of come in. Feel free to reach out. Happy to connect or follow, and looking forward to connecting with you.
Brilliant. It's been such a pleasure having you on, Andrew. I'm delighted to learn loads more. And thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.